So I'm going to defer most of my remarks until after today's presentation in light of the hour. There is one change to our traditional format because we're doing this virtually today. The Q&A today will not be done with me or Mike circulating with a handheld microphone. We're going back to the old-fashioned way today. We have to. Questions have to be read from the podium. So there is paper, there are pens and pencils at each table. If you have questions, write them down. They will be collected at the end of Dr. Moore's presentation. They'll be brought up to me and I will read them to the doctor. So with no further ado, let me proceed with Dr. Scott Moore's introduction. Obviously today our topic is China. Dr. Moore is the Director of China Programs and Strategic Initiatives at the University of Pennsylvania, where he directs 4 research and engagement fund programs, including those designed to support faculty-led projects in China, India, and Africa. Dr. Moore is a political scientist whose interests center on environmental sustainability, technology, and international relations. His first book, Subnational Hydropolitics, Conflict, Cooperation, and Institution Building in Shared River Basins, examines how climate change and other pressures affect the likelihood of conflict over water within countries. Prior to joining Penn, Dr. Moore was the Water Resources Management Specialist at the World Bank and Environment, Science, Technology, and Health Officer for China at the U.S. State Department, where he worked extensively on the Paris Agreement on climate change. Prior to entering public service, Dr. Moore was a postdoctorate research fellow with the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs at Harvard. Dr. Moore's research and commentary on a wide range of environmental and international affairs issues has appeared in a range of leading scholarly journals and media outlets, including the China Quarterly, Foreign Affairs, the New York Times, and Nature. Dr. Moore holds doctoral and master's degrees from Oxford and an undergraduate degree from Princeton. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Moore.
Thank you, David, and thanks for your patience in our setup here. Sorry I can't be with you in person, in part because that looks like a good lunch, and I'm getting a little hungry. So hope you're enjoying it. Nonetheless, we'll look forward to some discussion today. So thanks for that background and introduction. And I'll maybe just say that although planning to sort of focus specifically on China today, I did just come back from the climate talks in Dubai. Part of the reason I couldn't join you in person today was that just the scheduling issues there. And so I'd be happy to talk about that as well. As David kindly mentioned in the introduction, one thing that I've been interested in is China's role in climate change talks and negotiations. But I wanted to just sort of offer a couple of remarks at the opening, and then of course we'll look forward to your questions and comments. I wanted to start with a book that you can maybe hopefully see over my shoulder here. It's called China's Next Act. It came out last year. And I wrote that book because I think that most of the discussion on China and its role in the world kind of misses 2 really important and big things. And those 2 big things are, first of all, China's role in tackling and addressing shared global challenges, of which climate change is the most kind of important and probably pressing, but there are many others, including public health and preventing future pandemics, which of course we've only just really come out of a really serious one. And then on the other hand, China's role in developing and regulating new technologies, of which artificial intelligence is the best known, but there are many others. And in the book, I focus a lot on developments in biotechnology, gene editing, synthetic biology, et cetera. And something that's a little bit distinctive about China is that although it is still a developing country by most measures, because the level of investment that its government has put into these advanced technologies, and because of the very large and sophisticated human capital base that China has, it is a key player in the development of those advanced technologies, and therefore really important to thinking about how we deal with the consequences of those technologies, both good and bad. And in the book, I go into in a lot of detail why I think, although artificial intelligence and developments in biotechnology, robotics, other fields promise a lot of really significant benefits for humanity, they also pose a lot of significant risks. And China is going to be really important in trying to maximize those benefits and minimize those risks. So whether you're kind of looking at the field of sustainability or the field of technology, those are the two areas that I cover in detail in my book. China is really, really important. And yet at the same time, it's becoming more and more difficult for countries like the United States to work with China in order to tackle those shared challenges. And so most of the book is trying to figure out and think through that dilemma that, in a way, even as the US and other countries need China more than before, it's become more and more difficult to work together, and what that means and how to make some progress nonetheless. And I'm happy to go into some more detail on how I think that can be done if folks are interested. But that's the book. Getting kind of scoping out a little bit more broadly and sort of pulling us right into the present when it comes to China. I do think it's worth like doing a really, really brief history of China's recent history, both to kind of illustrate how we've sort of gotten to the present moment, both when it comes to US-China relations, China's role in the world more broadly, and then also to position us for thinking about where China and its relations with other countries may be headed into the future. And in that kind of very brief potted history, I think the place to start is 1979, when a few years after the Cultural Revolution, China makes the decision to kind of re-enter the international community, in particular and most famously by restoring diplomatic relations with the United States, as well as several other countries. This was the famous Nixon visit to China. And that kicked off a really remarkable decade from 1979 to 1989, in which China really pretty much entirely dismantled its centrally planned economy and had one of the more remarkable blossomings of entrepreneurship in economic history. The 1980s were a period of pretty extreme economic freedom and liberalization in China, as well as to a lesser but still significant degree political and social liberalization as well. This was a period in which there really was, at least relative to what we've seen in more recent decades, a whole lot of space for ideological discussion, disagreement, and all of that culminated in and ended with the Tiananmen incident in June of 1989, where, as probably you all know, the ruling Chinese Communist Party made the decision to crush what was largely a student movement calling for Western-style democratic and liberal political reforms. That then set the stage for the 90s, which was kind of a more complicated period, both politically and economically for China, but that essentially in which the government and the Chinese Communist Party decided to pursue economic liberalization without that political and social liberalization that you had seen in the 80s. So, I mean, there's definitely, that's a generalization, but basically what happened in the 90s is that the Chinese Communist Party decided to sort of split up those things which had in the 80s gone together. So it was really pursuing economic reform and liberalization, while certainly dialing back political and social liberalization. Probably the biggest event that happened certainly since Tiananmen was 2001, 2002, when China acceded to the World Trade Organization. And basically, if you look at any graph of China's economic performance, what you'll see is that right around that time, 2002, the graph maybe in the 90s had sort of started to go like that. It starts to go like that after around 2002. Accession to the WTO really turbocharged China's growth and gave us the China that we know, that's familiar sort of today as really the center of the world's manufacturing economy, and a country that grew far, far richer thanks to trade and foreign investment, otherwise known as export-led growth, meaning that the economy really grew and blossomed by drawing foreign investment and then using that investment in large part to develop manufacturing capabilities and capacity, which then translated into exporting goods to the rest of the world. Some things that maybe we can sort of go into, but in this kind of roughly 20-year period following WTO accession, China achieved a really, really remarkable feat in becoming essentially the center of the world's trade in any sort of manufactured, physical, tangible good. There are very few supply chains involving anything tangible, physical, manufactured, in which China didn't become the center of the world and of supply chains in that period. Once you get into the 2010s, and it's maybe worth just kind of mentioning briefly that also around this time, 2005, 2007, China surpassed the United States as the largest single source of greenhouse gas emissions, otherwise known as the world's largest emitter, and also the source of most of the world's environmental kind of damage and degradation, whether from greenhouse gas emissions, air pollution, water pollutants, driver of deforestation, all of those things, again, linked to China's rapid economic growth and the centralization of manufacturing capacity in China. As you kind of get into the 2010s, this really remarkably changed kind of economic position starts to translate into political and geopolitical importance. So you start to get greater and greater tensions between China and other countries, most notably the United States, over a variety of things. In part, military modernization. In this period, China's military starts to get much more capable, starts to receive much greater investment from the state. In part, technological. Chinese firms, Chinese research institutes start to get more and more advanced in terms of the technologies that they're developing and deploying both for commercial and other purposes, starts to get closer and closer to the kind of leading edge of technological development in other countries, and also partly in terms of diplomacy and foreign policy. So this is kind of a period where you see China start to be more aggressive in terms of some of its territorial claims in places like the South China Sea. And then you have kind of a whole set of human rights issues that starts to become more and more significant. Though it's worth mentioning that human rights, always a sharp divide between China and other countries in the modern period. But you do start to see kind of some increasingly concerning incidents. One famous example was the award of a Nobel Prize to Liu Xiaobo, who was imprisoned by Chinese authorities, but nonetheless received the Nobel Prize. Then in the most recent decade, all of those trends were supercharged in terms of tensions between China and other countries, principally the United States, across all of those dimensions: military, diplomatic, geopolitical, economic, technological. And of course, in the last 3 to 4 years, hanging over everything is the COVID-19 pandemic, which, as far as we know, originated in China. And I would argue kind of underscores, again, kind of coming back to the topic of my book, that even as these tensions have grown and deepened, at the same time, the COVID-19 pandemic, as well as climate change and other developments, reminds us that China does remain really central and critical to addressing shared global challenges. So even as those issues and tensions are getting deeper and broader, in some ways it's become more evident that the international community needs China more than ever as a result of that. Then just to take us right up to the present, an interesting aspect of the transition from the Trump to the Biden years in the United States has actually been that China-related issues haven't really changed very much. We still have virtually all of the tariffs that the Trump administration imposed on Chinese imported goods, and we certainly still have most of the political, diplomatic, military tensions with China, punctuated by things like China's decision to suspend dialogue with the United States on climate change and a whole other raft of issues in response to former Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan back in 2022, last year. That being said, just in the also, you know, it's funny to think of now, seems like a long time ago, but the beginning of this year, we had the now famous Chinese spy balloon incident, which caused a significant new set of tensions between the U.S. and China. That being said, in the last half of the year, in the last 6 months or so, there has been a significant effort by both the U.S. and China to try to improve and normalize, stabilize rather, their relationship, and to try to sort of set a bit of a more constructive foundation to improve economic ties, trade and investment, as well as cooperation on some of these shared global challenges. And that was illustrated by the fact that in the spring and summer, you had a succession of really high-level visits by U.S. officials to China: Janet Yellen, John Kerry, Antony Blinken, which incidentally almost never happens to have that kind of succession of high-level U.S. cabinet secretaries visiting another country in such a short period of time. And that was really trying to set the stage for the APEC meeting last month in San Francisco, where President Biden and Chinese President General Secretary Xi Jinping held their first in-person official summit since Biden took office. Worth mentioning that they actually know each other pretty well from Biden's stint as vice president. He had spent a pretty considerable amount of time with Xi Jinping during that time, so they know each other pretty well. But this was their first kind of official summit meeting since Biden became president. That produced a statement of cooperation on climate change, as well as a whole bunch of other things. And both sides were kind of signaling that they were hoping that meeting kind of at least stopped U.S.-China relations from continuing to deteriorate, and hopefully sets the stage for kind of more constructive things going forward. However, and this will be sort of my last point, and then we can sort of open things up. A lot of risks and uncertainties looking into both the near and medium term future. First and foremost, we have a U.S. presidential election coming up, in which I think it's fair to say that there's not much incentive either on the Republican or Democratic side to kind of sell to voters a moderate approach to China. It's pretty much the opposite, where from a political perspective, the only currency seems to be being sort of quite confrontational when it comes to China. So I think it's very unlikely that we'll see any movement in China policy or improvement in U.S.-China relations, at least until the outcome of the presidential election is known. There's also a Taiwanese presidential election coming up in January. And while it's very unlikely that is going to produce kind of any new developments for China, the United States, or Taiwan. It probably will highlight existing tensions. And obviously, for China, the major concern remains attempts by Taiwan to move closer to independence or sort of some greater statement of permanent autonomy from the mainland, from the People's Republic of China. We can certainly get into the Taiwan issue if people wish. My kind of standard line on this is I don't think any kind of conflict is very likely, and I in particular I don't think that the PRC, the People's Republic of China, would be tempted to mount some type of military action unless Taiwan were to declare independence, which in turn I don't think it would do at least for the next 4 years, because both presidential candidates in the Taiwanese election have essentially pledged not to do that. But in any case, we can certainly delve more into Taiwan if people wish. Last point, I think if these kind of near-term uncertainties can be resolved, what we can hope for is an improvement in the trade and investment picture, especially in terms of the US and China. And that relationship does remain extremely important. The US and China remain each other's most important single country trading partners, despite a sharp fall off in trade during the pandemic and as a result of the Trump era tariffs. So I think we can hope that trade and investment between the world's two largest economies will pick up a bit, assuming that these kind of near-term risks to improvement in U.S.-China relations can be avoided. The other thing to mention, though, is that China's economic situation is very cloudy over the medium term. The pandemic did expose a lot of, and I think sort of like accelerate a lot of systemic issues in China's economy. First and foremost, weakness and overcapacity in the property sector, which drives a lot of the economy and a lot of value creation. Disruption of that export-led growth, especially during the pandemic, with the kind of wild swings in demand for physical goods that the pandemic kind of caused, demographic headwinds, and several other factors that really kind of make China's medium-term economic outlook pretty cloudy. And again, we can certainly get into the details of that, but I think basically what it all adds up to is that we can expect pretty low growth out of China for the near term, and that will I think actually provide some incentives for the Chinese side to want to try to improve the atmosphere for foreign investment and trade promotion from the United States and other developed markets. So I can stop there, and happy to answer questions or hear some comments. And thanks again for your patience with our virtual presence here.
So if I can ask one of our fellow board members to start circulating and collecting questions, and while those questions are being brought up, Doctor, you mentioned that you just got back from COP28. We probably have 70 or 80 students with us today. So these are local high school students from Berks County. I'm sure we'd appreciate 5 minutes or so of your time to talk about your observations and perspectives from the conference.
Sure. And just maybe for a little bit of context, so the main kind of well, first and foremost, climate change is sort of the almost like the textbook example of a problem that requires international cooperation between countries to address, because fundamentally what climate change is a whole set of consequences that flow from the accumulation of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And those greenhouse gases accumulate for everything from burning coal to burning oil in your car to to burning trees or cutting down trees, and a whole host of other things that we as humans do on a daily basis. And the key thing is that the atmosphere doesn't care where any of that takes place. It doesn't care where a ton of coal is burned or where a gallon of gas is burned in your car. It all adds up in the atmosphere, and that means that in order to do something about climate change, you have to get every country on the planet together to agree to take common steps to reduce those sources of greenhouse gas emissions. And the way that the international community has tried to do that since 1992 is through something called the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. That's the primary international treaty that deals with climate change. It's one of the most universal treaties that there is. It has almost 200 parties. Pretty much every country in the world is part of it. But that agreement doesn't actually say anything about reducing greenhouse gas emissions, which is really the critical thing that has to be done if we're to really do much about climate change as a problem. And so for the last 30 years, we've had this sort of process of trying to develop additional agreements under the Framework Convention to actually cut and reduce greenhouse gas emissions. There have been some successes, the most notable of which is probably the Paris Agreement back in 2015, which for the first time committed every country in the world to taking specific actions to limit their contributions to climate change. But again, we haven't necessarily gotten quite to the point where all countries have agreed to specific concrete reductions in greenhouse gas emissions under this treaty. However, several major, actually at this point, almost every major economy in the world has put forward national plans to reduce emissions. So China, for example, has committed to reducing its carbon dioxide emissions, which are its most significant contribution to climate change, to zero on a net basis by 2060. The United States is committed to doing something similar by 2050. And Japan, other countries have committed likewise to doing something similar generally by around 2050. The key thing that kind of remains, though, is how to kind of try to bring all that together under an international agreement, as well as how to resolve a whole host of complicated issues around justice and equity and financing. So, a key concern with getting all countries to reduce emissions is, of course, that some can really afford to do so much more than others. For the least developed countries who still depend on energy sources like coal or even wood burning, it's probably going to take a lot of money and technology transfer to enable them to reduce emissions. And as you might imagine, that's pretty controversial for richer countries, which are expected to pay for that. And so a lot of the question in this third has been how you sort of resolve all of those really difficult issues. And COP28 in particular, which just concluded, had a lot of discussion about those financing issues, as well as a sharp debate over whether, for the first time, the negotiations would call for an end to fossil fuel use. So perhaps remarkably, over this 30-year period, there had never been an explicit kind of call or statement by the international community that we do have to eventually stop using fossil fuels. And that's essentially what the final agreement says, although there are some important caveats around things like, well, maybe there's still some scope for continuing to use fossil fuels if you can somehow capture the greenhouse gas emissions associated with that and ensure that they don't enter the atmosphere and contribute to climate change. So a lot of complicated stuff, but I think the sort of tagline is that what ended up coming out of COP28, which just concluded, was better than what was kind of feared would happen, but it's still nowhere near what's ambitious enough to really kind of tackle the challenges that we're facing with climate change.
Okay, thank you, Doctor. So the questions are coming up fast and furious here.
Great.
I'm going to start off with this one. Right now, we're seeing, a debate in Washington about whether aid should continue to Ukraine. I know some of the EU countries as well are starting to question their long-term commitment to providing aid. So if the result of that is decreased aid from the West that ultimately allows Russia to achieve some or all of its strategic objectives, will China take note with respect to how the West reacted here, and how might that affect China's thinking on a reunification with Taiwan at some point?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think the short answer is definitely yes. I think the most kind of significant thing to come out of the Ukraine crisis is a form of unity between the U.S. and its allies that you really hadn't seen before. And that's not something that, for the most part, is in China's interest, or that it wants to see. So to the extent that that unity fractures, that's probably going to be received well, or perceived to be positive by Beijing. And it's maybe worth actually taking a step back to say that, and this is a point that U.S. Officials under the Biden administration make all the time. If you kind of put the U.S. and its treaty allies together, so meaning the U.S. plus the European Union plus the United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, Japan, you add South Korea, you add all that up, and you get pretty much an economic technological bloc that far eclipse China plus Russia, or any other conceivable grouping that China could sort of mount in response. It's just a pretty overwhelming sort of block if you put the U.S. and its allies together. The problem, of course, and the question, I think rightly gets at this, is it's hard to actually keep that block united and kind of working toward a shared purpose. These are very different countries that have very different interests and perspectives. Over time, I think you have actually seen them develop more of a common vision of relations with China, and I think a sense of threat that China poses, in part because of its willingness to back Russia in Ukraine. But I think it is very possible that we'll see that the unity kind of fragment more, and I think that will be to China's advantage. And I think make it seem more plausible for China to take aggressive steps in whether it's in Taiwan or elsewhere. Mm-hmm. Though I just add as a final point that, again, as I mentioned earlier, in my view, there's not an imminent risk of a military conflict involving Taiwan.
So here's another China question. How much does economic interdependence limit the risk of conflict between China and the United States? Will there come a point where China, as a new hegemon, feels more free to seek more benefits from the international system, or will interdependence and a liberal institutionalism prevent conflict or minimize the risk of conflict in the long run?
Yeah, that's another really excellent question. There's a whole kind of field of academic study on pretty much exactly this subject. One of the best known authors or scholars who's written about this is Niall Ferguson, for anybody who may be kind of interested in delving deep into this question. I'll just sort of give you the sort of quick and surface. answer, which is and it's sort of my interpretation of this research and this literature, is that yes, it does, that economic interdependence does constrain or make less likely the risk of military confrontation, but it by no means prevents it necessarily. Unfortunately, there are instances in both the First and Second World Wars were among them where, despite a pretty strong degree of economic interdependence, that did not prove sufficient to prevent the outbreak of war. So I think while it's a positive influence, it by no means assures that there won't be military conflict. I think another way I might kind of look at that question is, again, thinking about, well, what exactly would provoke that type of conflict, given that I think both for the US and China, there are very good reasons to want to avoid military conflict. And again, I think Taiwan is the most obvious example of a scenario that would cause conflict. But again, I don't see that risk being very high, at least for the next 4 years. If there were ever to be a president in Taiwan who were elected who would be willing to declare independence, then I would say the risk would be very high. And then it would really be a matter for the United States to decide how to respond to that scenario. But fortunately, I don't think that's a plausible scenario, at least for the next 4 years.
Question about China's president. How secure is he politically within China? In light of, growth rates today aren't what they were 10 years ago. I think China is currently going through some devaluation of prices, real estate collapse. We're seeing a lot in the news about that right now. How, if at all, does that affect his ability to continue leading the Chinese Communist Party?
His position is pretty secure. There have been persistent rumors really since he took office about sort of coup attempts or kind of reshuffles, and there's essentially no evidence of any kind of organized opposition to Xi Jinping's position as General Secretary of the Chinese Communist Party or President of the People's Republic of China, or indeed Chair of the Central Military Commission, which are the three really critical leadership roles in China. That doesn't mean that there's no opposition to him. It just means that I don't think there's any credible sort of effort to remove him from any of those positions. And I think really it has less to do with kind of satisfaction of Xi Jinping's performance. Frankly, a lot of leaders who ruled during the pandemic, his credibility was pretty shattered coming out of that, and I think has been further dented by economic weakness. But the fact is, there's really no viable alternative to Xi Jinping. The control of the Chinese Communist Party over Chinese society is very well entrenched. Doesn't mean it could never be dislodged, but it means that the kind of threshold for doing that is very, very high, and I don't think we've seen anything like the conditions that would prompt something like that. And within the Chinese Communist Party, likewise, Xi's kind of control over that apparatus is pretty tight. I have, and Chinese elite politics is like, again, a whole field of study that people, spend entire careers parsing, hand gestures and body language to see, kind of like who's in, who's out. So, I don't have any special knowledge of the dynamics sort of at the top and among Xi's kind of colleagues on the Politburo Standing Committee or anything like that. But I sort of have a view that, frankly, no one else really wants that job, who would be in a position to get it or take it. And I think that's also worth bearing in mind. For apart from dissatisfaction or sort of opposition to Xi, I think there are a lot of good reasons why no sane person would want that job.
Doctor, we heard from another presenter this past fall on Russia, who suggested that China might have some strategic designs on some territory within Russia's far eastern district. Has your research run across that?
I haven't specifically looked at that. So I wouldn't want to offer a very unqualified answer. I think what I would say is that I think that is probably the biggest reason to doubt that China and Russia would ever formally conclude an alliance. And it's worth keeping in mind that although the two countries have gotten very close over the last few years, and especially since Russia's invasion of Ukraine, they are not allies. China does not have treaty allies in the same way that the United States does. I think the biggest reason to believe that Russia would never, even if China were willing to do it on their side, biggest reason to think that it wouldn't happen would be a sort of almost existential fear on Russia's part, or mistrust about the power imbalance between Russia and China. One implication of which is that China is economically stronger in the Russian Far East and in Siberia than Russia itself is. And again, I don't know the details of this, but I know certainly before the pandemic, there was a lot of population movement. Most of the merchant commercial class in the Russian Far East was in fact Chinese.
So during your presentation, you talked to us about what the United States is doing to attempt to mend its rift with China. And part of that includes, some very high level, exchange of, cabinet members. Can the United States be doing more? And if so, what would you like to see us be doing?
I really think the foundation of the U.S.-China relationship is trade and investment. So I think the prize is undoing the Trump era tariffs and just sort of boosting economic confidence, which I do think would be good for both sides economically. I do sort of hasten to add, though, that a lot's changed since 2016, 2017. And one of the things that's changed is China has engaged in some especially egregious human rights abuses in that period, especially in Xinjiang. And so I do think that, even though there's a strong kind of economic rationale for removing tariffs and things like that, I believe it's important to also sanction some of those human rights abuses, or put another way, to ensure that any kind of policy measures that are taken do acknowledge and try to punish and deter those human rights abuses that have taken place in the past few years. But I think that's probably the most constructive thing that could be done.
Do you believe that China will eventually transition towards a service-based economy, as the United States did over the course of the last 50 years? I guess the question, looks to some similarities, between the two countries in terms of their, economic growth, tremendous manufacturing growth. And at some point, our economy started to transition into more of a service one. Do you see that on the horizon for China at some point in the future?
Short answer, yes. And to some degree, it's already happened. I don't have the figures just in front of me, but I do remember seeing those. And the growth of the services sector in China has been pretty impressive just in the last decade or so. The bigger question is whether China can sort of plug the hole that most large developed economies plug with consumer spending. So one of the standout features of the Chinese economy is that consumer spending remains low in comparison to other sort of large developed economies as a percentage of the total economy. So government or state spending and investment remains much more important than consumer spending. The problem with that is that, as I mentioned earlier, the kind of export-led growth model that sustained that high proportion of investment in the Chinese economy has started to get a lot more wobbly. And at the same time, while China's state and government isn't, at risk of default or anything like that, it doesn't have a ton of additional room for fiscal growth. And so the question becomes how you try to encourage more consumer spending. And that's where some of the problems with the property sector really come into play. The vast majority of China's household wealth is tied up in real estate and property investments. So when you have a weak real estate sector, that translates into low consumer confidence and low propensity for consumer spending. Then there are other issues, cost of education and healthcare keep going up. It's familiar, for us here in the U.S., but places a lot of pressure on Chinese households to save for those expenses, as opposed to to sort of more consumer discretionary spending. Then there's also things like the dominance of the state-owned sector, which is about 35% of the Chinese economy, very inefficient and tends to crowd out consumer spending and more efficient private sector investment. So you sort of add all that up, and even though there is a growth in the services sector, it doesn't necessarily translate automatically to sustained economic performance.
Can you talk to us a little bit about the current state of China's Silk Road Initiative as a foreign policy tool?
Yeah, and this is something that there are several kind of related initiatives. So there's Silk Road, which actually predated Xi Jinping, but Xi has kind of supercharged it, and then also sort of brought it under the broader rubric of the Belt and Road Initiative, sometimes called One Belt, One Road. But basically, this is the sort of notion of linking the Chinese economy more closely to Eurasia, as well as Africa, South Asia, the Middle East, in some conceptions, Latin America. So really, most of the world other than North America, more closely, both primarily through infrastructure. But the idea is obviously that trade and movements of people and investment sort of follows the infrastructure. And so this is something that Xi Jinping kind of largely hatched until recently. It was his signature foreign policy initiative. It's since been complemented by something called the Global Security Initiative, but it remains kind of an overarching strategy for China's role in the world. I think what you can say about how that's gone is rather disappointingly in its initial phases, both in terms of the economic return for a lot of the initial investment projects, as well as in the degree of backlash that it received in a lot of countries. And so what you've seen more recently is a call for better quality of Chinese overseas investments as opposed to quality, and more emphasis on environmental sustainability, social responsibility, things like that. So it's kind of been dialed back pretty considerably since it was first launched, but it definitely remains an important kind of overall strategy. I think it's just sort of not met. It's been considerably less kind of effective than the initial objectives stated.
Okay, so pivoting to COP, we have a COP question. As the world's largest emitter, what does China's energy future look like?
Decarbonize like the rest of the world, with some big caveats. So I think the probably the most important thing to realize is that in most parts of the world, renewable energy sources, especially wind and solar, are the cheapest forms of electricity. So pretty much everywhere in the world, your first choice for getting new sources of power into electricity grids is going to come from wind and solar. That's really good news, and that's only going to continue and accelerate. The kind of caveats more come in where, first of all, we still don't have a great way of storing the energy that those renewable sources produce. And that means that when you don't quite have enough wind and solar power or other renewable power to meet demand, or when you have too much wind and solar coming into the grid, there's not a good way to buffer that or to store it, and you need something else. And there are alternatives. So in some places, they use hydropower. Interestingly, Uruguay has been pretty successful at more or less phasing out fossil fuels because they rely on a mix of hydropower and solar. You could also conceivably use nuclear, although for most countries, that's too expensive to use. For most of the rest of the world, you still have a role for fossil fuels, especially gas, to kind of fill that gap in electricity generation. Then you have two other big problems. One is heavy industry. So it's things like steel, cement, those kinds of sectors where other metals, where it's very energy intensive. And there's not really a good way to do it with renewables yet. Hydrogen is probably the ultimate solution there, but it's not commercial really yet. And then the third kind of set of problems you have to solve is transport, both vehicles as well as aircraft and ships. Part of the answer may be electrification, especially for ships, maybe some aircraft. But for and for electric vehicles, of course, batteries. But for like heavy duty trucking, long haul aviation, it's probably going to be hydrogen fuels, which again, we still have some way to go. So that's kind of the overall picture, and that's also true for China. So China is all the new capacity in the grid almost is renewable, but they're still building coal and still building nuclear to try to provide that buffering and sort of additional storage capacity. And then they haven't solved the heavy industry or transport sectors, just like the rest of the world.
So I think we have time for one more question. You mentioned, Doctor, about how China has targeted the Mideast as one of the regions to benefit from its Belt and Road Initiative. What I have yet to see any evidence of is of China taking that newly found, economic clout that it has in the region to the next level of trying to serve as a peacemaker for some Middle Eastern conflicts. Do you see that on the horizon at any point in the future for China?
It's a good point, and I would agree with that. And interestingly, that's come up a lot in the COP talks in the last 2 years, where China is still treated as a developing country, but which means that it's not expected to contribute money for climate adaptation or to help poorer countries decarbonize. But some of other developing countries, poorer developing countries, have started to criticize China for that and say, actually, China, it has now grown wealthy enough that it should be contributing money to that. So I think that situation may start to change. In terms of the Middle East and peacemaking, though, I think that's true. There was China did play apparently an important mediating role in sort of an agreement between Iran and Saudi Arabia earlier this year that attracted some attention. But from what I understand, when you sort of dig down, China's role was not especially significant, and it didn't really signal a real change in China's general unwillingness to, to play the role of mediator. I mean, a final point on that, I think if you kind of just look at how China's approached, Ukraine and the current Israel-Palestine conflict in particular, China's been more willing than in the past to, kind of propose some potential settlements and solutions, but it hasn't really offered itself as an impartial and disinterested party, and it hasn't been willing to give up any of its long-held positions. So in the case of Russia-Ukraine, really kind of backing Russia, or in the case of Israel-Palestine, really kind of backing the Palestinians. So it hasn't really proven willing to be very flexible on long-held foreign policy positions for the purpose of mediating or peacemaking, which I think it's probably fair to say that to be effective in either case, Ukraine or the Middle East, it would have to sort of be a little bit more flexible than it's been so far.
Thank you. So, Dr. Moore, thank you for your time today. I'm going to be mailing you, all of our presenters get a gift from us. It's a ceramic plate that's handmade for the Greater Reading World Affairs Council by a local artisan. Has our name on it. It has some stuff on it that relates to our Pennsylvania Dutch culture here in the middle part of the state. So I'll be sending that off to you, but we really appreciate your time today. You're relatively close. So hopefully sometime in the future, 1, 2, 3 years from now, we'll have a chance to invite you back and we'll be able to see you in person.
Yes, absolutely. I should maybe mention my whole mom's side of the family is from York, Lancaster County. So have some ties to the central part of the state, certainly.
Well, then we definitely will be having you back. But thank you again, Doctor, and you have a good rest of your day.
Thank you. Thanks so much to you all, and you all too. Thank you.